moving on to the next speaker, and I guess moving to an industry perspective, the next speaker is Dr. Pierre Broun, who's head of the R&D Center at Nestlé. Pierre received his PhD from the University of Cornell, and after part of his career in academic environments, he ended up moving to Nestlé, where he developed quality and sustainability for raw materials for the company, with a focus on coffee and cocoa. And most recently, he's been working on developing ties with academic institutes, in particular collaboration with the University of Cambridge and NIAB in the UK. So without further ado, I'll invite Pierre up to the stage.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And thanks for the organizers and Maurice and the team to have invited me to present today a little bit on our work on plant science at Nestlé, and how we believe in plant science, and believe it will have an important role to play in the future of food for industry, but also beyond, of course. So I'll have two parts to my talk. One first part, I'll sort of lay out the global context, and then in the second part, I'll talk about how we see that plant science can help address some of the challenges and opportunities for food in a way that's very much consumer-centric. So I guess it's something I wanted to insist on in my talk, is how much emphasis we put on the consumer, and maybe this is something that you'll find a bit different and interesting. So I'm not going to dwell on this. We've heard a lot about the evolution of the world, and obviously the need to feed a large population in the relatively close future. But the population is also changing. It's aging, so this presents some interesting challenges in terms of adapting the food propositions to the consumers. And it's also, on average, a richer population, which means that, for example, the middle class is really increased quite a lot in the past few years. So that also, all of this together has changed the composition and the capacities of the consumers, and needs to be taken into account when you're looking at consumer products. So thankfully, there is less hunger. We heard about it this morning. So the diets on average have more calories. There is more need for protein, and we know all the challenges that it presents in terms of being able to have, for example, the meat products that the consumers want, but also developing some alternatives maybe in the future. And so this is really something that is quite central in how food companies are thinking nowadays. So there is the issue of calories, but there's also the issue of hidden hunger and nutritional problems, which range from overnutrition all the way to undernutrition. So in the, let's say, affluent world, there are issues with overnutrition, which means that there's nutrient excess, overweight, obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we find a population that is suffering from deficiencies, so mainly protein, but also micronutrient deficiencies. So over 2 billion people are thought to suffer from some kind of deficiency in either of the big four, iodine, vitamin A, zinc, and iron. So at the other end of the spectrum is about 2 billion as well that are suffering from nutrient excess. So all of this needs to be addressed in one way or another, and we heard some of the interesting ways that this is being done in terms of biofortification. But obviously, the food industry has to look at this and address it as well. So in 2015, 193 nations signed on to this global development, sustainable development goals, and of which the first three are alleviating poverty, eliminating hunger and developing the health and well-being of the populations. And this is really central to also what the food industry has to face and has to adhere to. And so all of this in a consumer-centric fashion. So I wanted to talk a little more about the consumer and the big trends that we're facing. It's actually quite an exciting time in food. It's quite a revolution in how food is presented and offered, and what the composition of the food companies and their offerings is evolving. So one of the very important trends nowadays is that the consumers are a lot more diligent and engaged and interested in what is in the food, how it's made, where it's coming from. And so, for example, 7 of 10 US consumers want to know and understand the list of ingredients on the package. So this is probably relatively new. And then there's a number of claims that people are seeing on packages. This is becoming quite important. What's in the food, what it's made of, how it was made, that has to do with claims on the package that have increased about 7-fold since 2010. So there are opportunities for food companies to develop attractive products and stories to tell, and this has to do with the ingredients, in particular plant ingredients in the product. So another opportunity for plant science. Another important trend in foods is that the consumers are after a more diverse and healthier offering, and so they're interested in new ingredients. And as you know, plant breeding has been mostly about 5 main crops, and mostly about calories and productivity, disease resistance, and not so much about keeping a very diverse offering of very high-performing crops that deliver in the plate, the health and the taste that consumers expect. So, as an example, so you can see, I've heard that more vegans, people care about sugar, about fats. Gluten-free is now everywhere, and right or wrong, but consumers are after this type of claim. And then as an example, there's a 36% increase in product launches in 2017 with brain claims. So cognition, how much the product is going to help you, and the child develop in the right way. So Nestlé is part of this. So, for example, the product Cerelac, which is a very important product in Africa, for example, is also claiming the positive effect has on the development of child cognition. Another important trend is that the consumers expect less waste in the food chain, and also now what's developing, interestingly, is these shorter farm-to-fork circuits. So this is something which is relatively recent, but as an example, there's this, I don't know if you've heard about this, but this facility that's being built in Sweden that's called Plantagon, which will be a 16-story building, which farms and offices. It will open in 2020, which will have stores and wholesale operations. And the idea is that this building will save a lot of carbon emissions, a lot of water, and will produce enough food to feed 5,000 people every year. So this is kind of an extreme example, but there's a lot happening in that area of urban farming, getting the food produced closer to the consumer, getting fresher offerings, and also having a lower environmental footprint as a result of the use of inputs as well as transportation and so on. So this is another important food trend. And then there is the way the consumer is going to have access to food, and now more and more the consumer is interested in an enriching experience going to the grocery store. It's not so much about going and grabbing food, putting it in the cart and going away. It's also interacting more with the food ingredients, being inspired in terms of food preparation and getting ideas. And so food halls are developing everywhere. And then in parallel to this, there's the online aspect. And so it's thought that there's going to be about $20 billion additional sales in the next 5 years on online grocery. And then, participating in this will be your refrigerator telling you what it needs, what you're supposed to be wanting, and a lot of ordering that will be done, through smart devices. And then, there's also blockchain. Everybody's talking about blockchain, but there is also an aspect of blockchain that's in the food chain. And for example, there's a company called INS Ecosystems, which has raised a lot of money to basically circumvent the kind of supermarket and offer branded products directly to consumers, which is something to please some of the branded product companies. So these are some of the important trends that we have to basically keep in mind. So in order to develop the new offerings, this is going to obviously rely on agriculture, and we've heard a lot about the challenges in terms of producing on a limited footprint, climate change, crop disease, but also the degraded soils, the ecosystem that's kind of needs to support the crops that are going to have to deliver even more, but sometimes very kind of poor and degraded conditions, especially in Africa and other developing countries where there are very poor soil conditions. And then there's the farmer. We need farmers who can do all of this, who have the capacity and who also find farming attractive enough to stay in business and do it. And so this is going to be very important. So there are opportunities with plant science to improve productivity, resilience of the crops, but also to improve the taste and the nutritional value of products that are using these ingredients. Hopefully all of this is going to be done in a more environmental friendly, using agroecological approaches to take care of soil and the ecosystems. And the farmer is going to have to be empowered in order to be able to farm smarter, and also will have to be within a strengthened supply chain. So if you look at Africa, for example, there's an awful lot of opportunities, but also limitations in terms of not only the farmer ability to deliver, but also the supply chains that come with that they have to operate with. So it will take a complete package. So we've heard a lot about the genetics, but it's also about the agronomy and all sorts of kind of peripheral technologies that are going to be implemented to help the farmer to deliver. And the use of modern methods, and we've heard a lot about genome editing and all sorts of kind of genome-aided breeding, and all of this will need to participate, even if the consumer sometimes has some reservations and some fears, rational or not, about some of these technologies. So the right balance has to be struck between the offering, the use of technologies, and also how much really they can be delivered at the other end to the consumer. So I'm going to move on now to some of the actual concrete examples of what we have been involved with and how a company like Nestlé has been using plant science to create new opportunities for food products. So Nestlé's ambition with plant ingredients is to, in particular, harness the benefits of plants to delight consumers and improve their nutrition and health. And so there is a possibility to leverage healthy and more nutritional ingredients from plants to develop new products. And this is something that we are looking at closely. It's not just about using traditional ingredients. It's also looking beyond what is actually the diversity, what are the new sort of crops that can enter into the composition of our products to deliver better health benefits. But it's not only just the taste and the health benefits, it's also how well the ingredient will behave from the farm all the way to the consumer, which means it's the way it will be processed, the primary processing, the manufacturing of the products, the stability of the products, the functional characteristics of the ingredient in the product. So there's an awful lot of things to be looking at in order to develop a new ingredient to offer a better product. So these are technological functionalities to kind of summarize. And then all of this to improve also the offering, the sensory potential, the benefits to the consumer, as well as the sustainability of the supply chain is extremely important. So Nestlé is a big company. It has close to $100 billion turnover. It has a number of different businesses that use a range of ingredients that are listed here. And to just give you an idea of the scale, Nestlé buys about 10% of the coffee, of all of the coffee and all of the cocoa that's produced every year in the world. So that is a challenge always of volume, getting the volumes at the right quality year in and year out. And this is something that is not a very simple issue to solve. It's many different countries. It's a lot of issues with logistics, with working with the trade, working with the farmers in order to get to this. And some of the major raw materials that Nestlé uses, in particular coffee and cocoa, are quite vulnerable raw materials. Why? Because farming is difficult. It's often smallholder farmer with vulnerable farmers who have to often live at the threshold or below the threshold of poverty, which means that something has to be done to help them stay in farming, improve their condition, and all of this in a context where they have to deal with different environmental challenges, the challenge of the economics, the increasing labor and input costs, for example, sometimes not having the level of understanding of education to be able to improve. So this means having a volume of 10% of the world crop every year means relying on raw materials that have these challenges. That means Nestlé has to work with the farmers and with the supply chain partners in order to achieve this. So our approach to plant science, so we do plant science at Nestlé, and our approach has been to, first of all, leverage external expertise. Most of the plant science actually occurs outside of the company, obviously in seed companies, in the public sector. But there is also some internal research which has to do with filling business relevant gaps that there's nobody out there to take care of that. And if you look at this diagram, it sort of wants to show that for some of the major raw materials, there's plenty of research going on. But for some of the other raw materials and issues, there's not always the intensity of research that's necessary. Coffee and cocoa is one example. But if you look at, for example, the amount of research that takes place on mycotoxins, contaminants, we heard about cadmium, but there are others, biofortification, and then a host of important crops. This is not just enough, and something has to be done. Sometimes it's done internally to the company, or we try to develop opportunities in collaboration to address those. And so we have recently established a collaboration with the University of Cambridge in the UK. And the idea there is that while we have some strength in coffee and cocoa, we need to rely on deep knowledge as well as crop science in order to deliver on some other crops. So we heard about wheat. NIAB in the UK is quite strong in wheat. They also work on some other crops, but it's also the Southern England sort of ecosystem that's quite strong, with John Innes and some of the others who we want to work with in particular. But that doesn't stop there. We want to collaborate more widely with world-leading organizations in order to be able to help on the plant ingredient side. So in the case of coffee and cocoa, we're quite strong internally. We have also developed a very extensive network of collaborators in producing countries that's pictured there. It's very important to work with institutions in the country and through them, and sometimes with them, to deliver some of the against some of the important kind objectives that we have for raw materials. So quite an extensive number of countries. We work in about 20 different countries, and this is it's very important to take into account the local supply situation in order to get the answer to the local question we're trying to address. So I'm going to go through some of the challenges that I talked about before, and one of the issues is I don't know why it's changing. Sorry, malnutrition is one of the issues that we're trying to address. Today, it's through product fortification, and Nestlé is today serving some over 200 billion servings of fortified products. This is something that's works quite well because of the format of some of our products. For example, the Maggi cube, which is consumed by over 90% of households in Western Africa, where it's really a vehicle. So the households buy Maggi cubes to flavor the food, and that can be a vehicle for delivery of fortification. But tomorrow, what we would like to move to is have more of a biofortified ingredient that we can use straight into our products. And we've tried to work with all the research ecosystem to sort of help jumpstart the development or the commercialization of biofortified crops. And for example, in Nigeria, we are buying some provitamin A fortified maize to make a local product, which is called Golden Morn, which is quite a decent volume to try to help introduce biofortification. In doing so, we hope that we can also stimulate the supply chain in using this orange maize, which is a bit of a foreign concept in Africa, so have sort of not only a direct effect on the consumer, but also an indirect effect around the supply chain in the rural communities. So, in terms of developing against the wishes of the consumers for more authenticity and very kind of sort of more personalized offerings, we are working on coffee to develop outstanding Arabica sort of cup quality, and in doing so from field to cup. So the idea is to rebreed coffee to deliver outstanding new coffee experience that can be can access the consumer through the supply chain, going through the farmer and the trade all the way to our products. This is quite a challenging undertaking, but we've started this in Colombia in particular, and have, for example, tested about 20 different varieties of Arabica in 8 different locations in Colombia in order to identify what are the best sort of environments and varieties in that lot that can deliver the productivity that the farmer will need, as well as the really outstanding cup quality we are after. And so this is the type of work that has been going on. So in the bottom left panel, you can see some of the kind of trials comparing the varieties we've introduced with the best lines available locally, as well as some of the commercial varieties, and also at the same time cupping extensively, getting samples sent over, cupping and deciding on which combination of variety and environment and terroir can allow us to get to an offering that will be very specific and correspond to the particular demand that the consumer and the business is trying to meet. And it doesn't stop there. So once you have developed a variety, and this is an issue with a lot of kind of new crop development, is you have to be able to scale up, and this is often where a lot of things stop. So biofortification is also facing some of these challenges of scaling up, to getting up to scale. So in that case, what we are trying to do is to engage with partners to very rapidly multiply the trees locally, to have them available for the farmers at the right price, have the trees delivered, planted farmed with entrepreneurial coffee growers, with agronomic support, so that ultimately the coffee can get to the trade, gets purchased by Nestlé and manufactured into products. So it's quite a circuit that you have to go through. It's a long-term effort. It's sometimes a challenge to get a company to be patient all the way through this, but quite an interesting opportunity to actually develop something quite unique at the same time, and at the same time as offering to the farmers new opportunities in order to increase their profitability. So this is some of the pictures of developing the embryos, growing the plantlets, and then what's really important is to also take care of the traceability. So what we've been working on is developing some techniques, DNA traceability techniques, that will very specifically recognize varieties that we're after in our supply chain, and also facing some of the challenges that we may have, because there's allopollination at a certain level, for example, with Arabica, and this is acceptable. What we don't want is adulteration. So, in some cases we have single variety products, like Nespresso has had this Dulçal de Brazil capsule, and we developed a method to make sure that throughout the supply chain we could maintain the traceability. So more diverse, healthy ingredients is really something that we would like to capitalize on, and this slide is to show you the first that in the consumption of, and this is borrowed from a slide that Howard Buis of Harvest Plus presented. That slide shows that compared to 1965, the consumption of pulses has gone way down in, I believe it's in different countries that you can see there. So this is not only pulses, but there's a number of species that have gone underused, that have not been taken care of. On the right, there was an interesting diagram that I saw in Nature Plants, which shows the amount of publications that have to do with different crops in proportion with, or let's say in relation with the cultivated area of these crops. And you can see that while some of the crops that are not cultivated on a very large scale don't get a lot of publicity, this is understandable. Some of the crops, such as sorghum or millet or cassava, which are quite important, grown on a lot of area, are not necessarily, or some of the protein crops are not necessarily getting the same level of R&D intensity. So something needs to be done, and there's a lot of potential in those crops as well. And so we talked about, we heard a lot about wheat. There's a lot of potential in terms of nutritional diversity to look at different cereals. So Nestlé has a number of cereal products, either for children or breakfast cereals. And there's potential in using different species to actually improve the nutritional offering of these products. That's just an example. But I just illustrate with some slides on the project that we've started recently, which has more to do with protein. There is a huge demand now for plant protein. It's really something that's clearly happening. For example, plant milks today represent something like a $2 or $3 billion market. You see them everywhere. Often these plant milks are not very rich in protein, actually. So there's more and more demand for plant protein in a variety of contexts, but that's generally going to be alternatives to animal proteins, and there's a number of interesting things there. But plants certainly have a role to play very, very rapidly in this. And so we are starting to examine this, and we're doing this with Cambridge, is to grow a number of plants that are interesting sources of protein for various reasons, and to look at the biodiversity that exists within these species, and look at the promise of the protein from these very different genetic backgrounds, not only in terms of nutritional nutritional value, but also in terms of technological performance, for example, solubility, for example, pH stability, and a number of things that are not necessarily looked at in order to define which could be the sources of protein for the future. So this is something that we are doing with NIAB and with Cambridge, also in collaboration with UC Davis. This is quite an extensive survey that we are doing. What we want to do is we want to screen the crops. We're going to very rapidly prototype the protein extracts. We're going to compare this with consumer insights in terms of taste, color, stability, in terms of also nutritional value, and then rapidly go on the most interesting leads and either rapidly deliver some new products based on existing varieties or potentially engage with partners in breeding to improve what is going to be promising. So this is kind of an important aspect of how we see plant ingredients will develop as a new offering for interesting proteins as an alternative to animal proteins to fulfill the market needs on this. I'll give another illustration of an interesting piece of work that we did, which is relatively unusual. I don't think that breeders usually look at things in the same way. What we asked is, what is the favorite carrot from a baby's perspective? Nestlé carrot is quite an important ingredient for baby foods, and probably not any particular variety is behaving the same, and so we wanted to know, what would be the best variety that we could use. So first of all, we had to kind of look at consumer preference drivers, and the consumers, that's the babies, but it's also their moms. So we had to really do some extensive research into this. And then we started to look at different carrot cultivars that are available, not only the traditional carrots using in processing, but also new fresh market cultivars, which have made a lot of progress in the past 20 years or so, and see whether there could be cultivars that would be preferred in comparison with what our preference drivers that we identified. And then the idea would be to kind of look at the sustainability of the chain with these new cultivars, and including the performance of the carrots in the processing part. And so what we did is that we looked at various varieties. We looked at their performance in the field. We did field trials in 3 different countries in Europe. We looked at the carrots. What do they look like in terms of homogeneity? A number of very important sort of quality also drivers. Woodiness is a no-no in carrots. You don't want to have woody pieces in carrot jars. And then we also looked at the taste diversity, and we found that carrots it's not a big surprise, I guess, for people who know carrots around here, but there's quite a bit of diversity in terms of taste. So, but the major things that we had to do is to really taste, have these carrots and carrot purees tasted by our consumers. And there's some kind of fun ways that this is looked at. So, the baby is being offered the different carrots, and those are the different varieties that are shown here, with a sort of kind of significance, statistical significance within the bars. And so, turning towards the spoon or rejecting the spoon or keeping the mouth open is some signs of preference. And then there's the mom also, who plays, of course, having the purse plays a very important role in all of this. But what's interesting is that there was a lot of agreement between the mother and the baby often, and so we were able to identify some interesting varieties that we decided to pursue. So, in order to do all of this, in order to do address the evolution of the needs of the consumer, and use plant science to develop new ingredients that will ultimately end up in a product, a lot of things have to happen, and this will take time. And this is really something that is a collaborative effort, where a number of supply chain partners have to get together in order to deliver. So seed companies often don't know what the consumer wants. The ingredient companies knows a little better, but has to talk to the food company. So all of us have to get together in order to address all of this. And so in some cases, there will be relatively quick opportunities when varieties that have not been looked at from a consumer perspective are looked at again and can potentially be amplified on the market to deliver against certain kind of consumer needs. In other cases, maybe there needs to be some breeding involved to get to the end result. And all of the different steps of the testing of the varieties, the testing in the processing, testing in the product, all of this needs to take place and often needs to be taken into account before starting the project in order to get to a successful result. So just to conclude on this, I just wanted to summarize that building the future of food is not just a single organization's affair. It's really a collaborative value chain affair, and those projects need to be taken into account, or they need to be designed end to end, so that ultimately they can be successful and result in new and interesting product offerings. So I will stop on this. Thank you.